Joining me now is the Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland. He's the ranking member of the Oversight and Accountability Committee. He served on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Congressman, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning. It's great to be with you, Ali.
Congressman, I'm interested in the fact that the conclusions that Jack Smith came to in his new filing about what is personal versus what is official don't feel like a responsibility he should have to have, but the Supreme Court said that they're going to have to parse this stuff. What's your sense of how he's done so, how he has made a much clearer determination that there's no possibility that these things Donald Trump did could have been in an official capacity?
Well, the Supreme Court's absurd decision finding that the president is immune from criminal prosecution for any criminal acts undertaken under the rubric of his office actually is an enormously clarifying thing. When you read Jack Smith's filing, you can see so clearly all of the cases, which was most of his conduct, where Donald Trump was acting not under the rubric of his office at all, but simply as a political candidate, a frustrated and angry political candidate who stepped outside of the rule of law and decided he was going to overthrow it. And, you know, it is not part of the job of the president to get involved with staging electoral college slates. That belongs to the states. It's not part of the president's job to enforce the presidential election in any way. If you read the Constitution, the president has no job, and obviously so, in conducting elections, yet he got involved, not as an official, not someone trying to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, rather as a political candidate trying to frustrate the entire process and then overturn the presidential election, which Joe Biden had won by more than 7 million votes, 306 to 232 in the Electoral College.
Congressman, one of the interesting things about this is that if Donald Trump wins the election, there's not much chance of this case seeing the light of day. But if he doesn't and it moves forward, it'll probably at some point get back to the Supreme Court. Does the way Jack Smith's laid it out put some pressure on the Supreme Court to say, all right, you've met our weird bar here, and there's no reason to prevent this case from proceeding?
Well, I think that's so. And I think, you know, Jack Smith filled in a whole bunch of new details that the January 6th Select Committee did not have access to, and the House impeachment team did not have access to when we went over to the Senate. I mean, we have the striking moment of Donald Trump saying, "So what?" when he's told that Mike Pence is fleeing for his life and exiting the building. On the contrary, right after 2 p.m., Donald Trump sent out a tweet saying Mike Pence did not have the courage to do what needed to be done. In other words, egging the mob on further, exhorting them to continue their attempts to get the vice president. And of course, the walls were ringing with the chant, "Hang Mike Pence, hang Mike Pence." And his response to it was, "So what?" There was also a very striking moment that caught my eye in this filing where Trump says to Mike Pence that hundreds of thousands of people will hate your guts if he doesn't cooperate with Trump's plan to set aside the presidential election and just claim office. That, to me, is a very striking moment because you can read it either as Donald Trump threatening him politically, which obviously it was, but you can also read it very clearly as Donald Trump threatening him physically. Hundreds of thousands of people, the kinds of people who Trump had just incited to come and storm the Capitol, will hate your guts. In other words, putting him in direct fear of his life. And that has been the tenor and the tone of everything that Donald Trump has said about the 2020 presidential election. And they continue to organize politically around the big lie. It's a remarkable thing. There was this woman just sentenced to jail for 8 or 9 years in Colorado, a clerk of court who continued to propound the big lie. And the judge's statements at the sentencing are just remarkable, saying you're a charlatan, you've been pushing these big lies, there's nothing behind them, and you're going to jail. But Donald Trump doesn't care. I hope at least that case will be a demonstration process project for people around the country who may be tempted to go with Trump in trying to overthrow a Kamala Harris victory in this presidential election.
And of course, you're talking about the case of Tina Peters, and I would encourage people who don't normally look at transcripts from court cases or rulings and judgments to do so, to see what this judge has said about Tina Peters. Congressman, the filing also, to your point about spreading the big lie, it presents communications that show that Donald Trump knew full well he had lost the election, but continued to spread lies about it, including evidence that Trump had no intention of respecting either the election outcome or the outcome of other audits, surveys, recounts. White House staffer is said to have overheard Trump telling family members, quote, "Doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell." The reason that's relevant is for what you just said. We are setting the stage now. Donald Trump is setting the stage for not accepting the outcome of the election. He's adding his xenophobia to it, saying that it's going to be a whole lot of immigrants who do not speak English, do not even know what country they're in, but somehow they're going to organize to vote for Kamala Harris. It sounds funny, but it's not.
Look, he had no official duty that he was executing when he tried to construct counterfeit electoral slates. There was no official duty he was executing when he said to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, "Just find me 11,780 votes." There was no official duty he was executing when he told Mike Pence to bow down to him and don't be so honest and all of that stuff. There was no official duty at stake. But we also know that there was neither an official nor an unofficial reason for him to believe anything was wrong. On the contrary, he was being told by everybody he had lost the election. So there's both objective and subjective reason to understand he was acting as a candidate, and as a candidate, he was acting as an outlaw candidate. And I would say he was acting like a tyrant in the strict Greek etymological sense of the term. He was acting as someone who wants to overthrow the constitutional order and comes from outside of the legal order, not accepting any of the rule of law in the process.
Congressman, good to talk to you as always. Thank you for joining us this morning. The Democratic Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland.